I remember the way the elevator doors opened onto the 20th floor that evening, the metallic whoosh echoing in my chest like a warning bell. The downtown Houston hotel was gleaming, its marble lobby still humming with guests arriving for banquets and conventions. But my destination was not the grand dining hall, it was the boardroom. The moment I stepped out of the elevator, I felt the weight of the polished oak doors at the end of the corridor. That room held my test, my chance to prove that I wasn't just the youngest Ainsworth daughter who lingered in the shadows. I wanted to show them I could stand on my own ground. Inside, the boardroom was already occupied. The long table gleamed under fluorescent lights, water glasses neatly arranged beside thick folders of financial summaries. Across from my seat sat two investors, men in their 50s, with eyes sharpened by decades of negotiations. They looked up briefly when I entered, then returned to their papers. My parents were already there, my father at the head of the table, stoic, his jaw set, my mother beside him with her usual air of forced grace. They didn't greet me. They just gestured to the empty chair across from the investors, like this was another exam I had been sent to fail. I sat down, steadying my hands under the table. My heart beat faster than I could control, but I whispered to myself, "You're prepared. You've read every report, rehearsed every number." Still, a shadow lingered in my mind. That evening, I didn't just risk losing a deal. I sensed I might lose the last sliver of respect my parents still pretended to have for me. I cleared my throat and began. "Thank you for coming. I'm Sybil Ainsworth. What I'm proposing tonight is a partnership that leverages your logistics expertise with our real estate expansion. Together, we can create a cost-effective—" One of the investors raised a hand. "Before we hear more buzzwords, I'd like to know, what's your track record?" I faltered. This would be my first independent project under the family company. His brow arched. "First project, but already asking for multi-million-dollar commitments?" The second investor leaned forward, his glasses glinting. "Do you have projections beyond these charts? Because what I'm seeing looks like wishful thinking." I glanced at my father. He sat motionless, hands clasped, eyes fixed on me but offering no support. My mother adjusted her bracelet, avoiding eye contact. I swallowed hard. "I've run the numbers thoroughly," I said, my voice tighter than I wanted. "Based on our past developments, the margins—" The first investor cut me off. "That's past performance. What about your leadership capacity? What makes you think you can manage operations of this scale?" My pulse raced. I tried recalling lines from the books I had pored over. "Success is built on adaptability. I've studied the market, and I believe—" He sighed, shaking his head. "Belief isn't enough in this line of work." The silence that followed was unbearable. The investors exchanged a glance, then one spoke firmly. "We'll pass on this opportunity." Just like that, the air collapsed around me. I felt the ground shift, as though the whole hotel had tilted. Before I could gather a response, my father's voice sliced through the silence. "You're useless." The words landed heavier than any rejection. His voice didn't waver. He turned to the investors, adding, "She'll never handle real business." My mother pressed her lips together, exhaling slowly. Then, barely above a whisper but loud enough for the room to hear, she said, "What a disappointment." I couldn't move. My cheeks burned, yet my body froze. I stared down at my notes, the black ink blurring before my eyes. Around the table, no one dared meet my gaze. The investors shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. An awkward silence expanded until I wished I could vanish into the leather chair. My father leaned back, his voice like gravel. "This is what happens when sentiment gets in the way of judgment. She was never ready." The humiliation cut so deep I barely noticed my hands trembling. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but the words wouldn't form. Then came the final blow. My father pointed toward the investors. "You will apologize." I blinked. "What?" "But it wasn't only my—" His eyes narrowed. "Say you're sorry. Do it now, or don't come home." The investors looked uneasy, but neither objected. They were used to witnessing power plays. I stared at him, heart hammering. "You can't make me." Apologize, he repeated, his tone cold enough to freeze every protest on my tongue. I turned to the men across the table. Their faces were politely blank, but I could see the discomfort in their eyes. I lowered my head. I apologize for wasting your time. The words tasted like ashes. One investor gave a tight nod, murmuring, "It's fine." The other cleared his throat, clearly eager to leave. My parents remained silent, satisfied in their victory. I wanted someone, anyone, to intervene, but no one did. No manager, no relative, no staff member. Everyone let it happen, as though humiliation was just part of my training. When the meeting finally adjourned, the investors left quickly, leaving behind the heavy stillness of defeat. My father stood, not looking at me. "This is the last time you humiliate this family under my roof." I didn't answer. I couldn't. The long hallway outside felt endless as I walked, my heels clicking against the marble. The glass walls reflected my image. Head bowed, shoulders tight, eyes stinging with restrained tears. I paused for a moment, staring at that reflection, and thought, this wasn't just a failed deal. It was the opening act of my exile. I took a deep breath, straightened my posture, and whispered to myself, one day, they'll regret calling me useless. The morning after the failed meeting felt heavier than any hangover I had ever known. I woke up in the guest room of our house, the walls still painted in the pale cream my mother had chosen years ago. A room that felt less like mine and more like a hotel. The sting of last night clung to my skin. Every word my father threw at me echoed in the silence. I moved slowly, aware that today would not be kind. At the breakfast table, the silence was thick. My parents sat across from me, coffee cups steaming, silverware clinking against porcelain. They spoke only to Maud, my older sister, who looked impeccable as always in her fitted navy dress, her blonde hair twisted neatly at the back of her head. "Maud, you'll have to step in and meet with the real estate team today," my father said, sliding papers toward her. "We can't afford to look weak." She nodded gracefully, accepting the task as though she'd been born for it. My mother smiled faintly, pride flickering in her eyes. They didn't even glance at me. I picked at my toast, unable to swallow. The staff cleared dishes quietly, eyes carefully averted from mine. Even they knew. Word had traveled faster than wildfire, that Sybil Ainsworth had failed, that she was now a liability. I wanted to scream that one mistake did not define me. But I also knew, in this house, weakness wasn't forgiven. It was branded. Later that morning, I found myself walking through the glass doors of the Ainsworth headquarters downtown. The lobby smelled of polished wood and fresh flowers, the kind of luxury meant to impress clients and intimidate employees. I had walked these halls 1,000 times, but today, every step felt like trespassing. Inside the conference room, executives filled the seats. My father stood at the front, tall, composed, his presence commanding the room. Behind him glowed a large screen, the company's organizational chart projected for everyone to see. I slid into a chair in the back, trying to appear invisible. Maud sat closer to the front, confident, radiant, perfectly at home. Father cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming. This company must remain strong, even in times of transition." He clicked the remote, and names shuffled across the screen. My chest tightened as I realized what was happening. Where my name had once appeared as a junior partner, it was gone, erased completely. "This company cannot afford liabilities," my father declared. My mother added softly, "We must show strength to the market, to our investors, to the world." A murmur ran through the room. Some executives shifted uncomfortably, others kept their eyes on their notes, unwilling to intervene. My heart pounded as though everyone could hear it. In less than 24 hours, I had gone from daughter to outsider, from member of the family business to a ghost. I forced myself to stay still, but inside, fury burned. I wanted to stand, to argue, to shout that I deserved better, but I knew any outburst would be seen as further proof of my incompetence. The meeting adjourned with polite applause, the kind that carried no warmth. People filed out quickly, avoiding my gaze. I lingered in the corridor, gripping my folder like a lifeline. That was when I heard laughter behind me. Maud, surrounded by a couple of cousins, strolled toward me. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor. She leaned closer, lowering her voice just enough for me to hear, but loud enough for others nearby. "Little bankruptcy," she whispered. The cousins chuckled. One smirked and added, "At least Maud knows how to close a deal." Maud tilted her head, her smile sugar-sweet. "Every family has a black sheep. We just gave ours a title." The words hit harder than the investor's rejection. This was no longer private shame. It was becoming my identity, something they could mock freely. I stared at her, forcing myself not to react. My fists clenched at my sides, but I kept silent. She wanted a scene. She wanted me to crumble. Instead, I let the silence speak, even if it tore at me inside. As they walked away, still laughing, I felt the fury coil tighter, transforming into something sharper. They thought their words branded me forever, but all they did was carve a scar deep enough to remind me why I had to fight. I stepped into the empty lobby, my reflection staring back at me from the glass doors. My face was pale, my eyes tired, but there was something else there, something they hadn't noticed. Beneath the shame was defiance. Eleanor Roosevelt's words surfaced in my mind. "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." I almost laughed bitterly. Consent? How do you withdraw consent when the ones calling you inferior are your own blood? I touched the glass lightly, as though steadying the reflection. "They see failure." "I see a fighter hidden beneath the ruin," I whispered to myself. The Houston heat slammed into me as I stepped outside. Cars rushed past on the busy street, horns blaring, people hustling about their lives. The world did not stop for my humiliation. And maybe that was the lesson. They thought the board erased me, but what they really erased was their last chance to keep me loyal. That evening, I walked into the restaurant with the kind of heaviness that even perfume and silk couldn't mask. The private dining room was already full of relatives, their laughter spilling into the hallway before the door closed behind me. Crystal chandeliers gleamed overhead. The table stretched long with candles and silverware arranged as if this was some state banquet instead of a family dinner. But to me, it didn't feel like a meal. It felt like Judgment Day. I saw Maud immediately, seated next to my father in the center, her hand resting lightly on his arm, as if she already belonged in that position of authority. He leaned toward her as he spoke, his voice low and approving. My mother's smile radiated only toward Maud, and when she noticed me, it tightened into something brittle and polite. Cousins raised their glasses, greeting me quickly before returning to their conversations. No one wanted to linger on me. I slid into a seat near the edge of the table, deliberately away from the center. The air was heavy with the scent of roasted lamb and wine, yet I could barely taste anything as I lifted a fork. I watched the way everyone orbited around Maud, listening to her every word, laughing at every anecdote. Their eyes skipped over me as though I was the extra guest no one knew how to introduce. This wasn't dinner, I thought as I pushed food around my plate. This is my trial. Halfway through the meal, my father rose, his glass of wine raised. Conversations hushed. All eyes turned to him, as they always did. He cleared his throat, smiling faintly. "Tonight, I want to speak of the future," he began. His voice carried, steady and commanding. "Our family has weathered storms, faced challenges, but what matters is the strength we show moving forward." He paused, glancing around the table before placing his hand on Maud's shoulder. "At least we have one real child to carry the name forward." The room erupted into polite applause. Guests nodded approvingly, clinking glasses. My mother leaned toward Maud, her smile glowing with pride. I froze. His words sliced through me sharper than any blade. One real child, not two, not me. I felt my pulse pound in my ears. Around me, relatives smiled, some trying not to look at me, others nodding more vigorously than necessary. A cousin whispered, "That's right," as if to cement the decree. My hands clenched under the table. I caught my mother's eyes for a fleeting second. They were cold, deliberate. She didn't flinch. Inside, my humiliation boiled. This wasn't about a failed deal or a single mistake. This was about identity. In America, we preach that every individual can succeed through grit, that you define yourself. But what happens when your own parents brand you defective, when they declare to a room full of witnesses that you are the failed child? I kept my face neutral, refusing to give them the satisfaction of watching me break. I may not answer tonight, I told myself silently, but one day I will. After dessert, when laughter had risen again, a photographer entered with equipment, wheeling in lights and stands. "Family portrait," he announced cheerfully. "To mark a new era." Everyone gathered quickly, lining up before the velvet backdrop. I moved to stand among them, trying to blend in. Just as I found my place beside my cousins, my mother stepped forward. Her perfume hit my nose as she leaned close, whispering so only I could hear. "Not you. This is for family only." I stared at her, disbelief flooding through me. Family only. The photographer hesitated, glancing nervously between us. My father gave a curt nod, signaling compliance. I felt the eyes of staff and relatives on me. Heat rose in my chest, but I forced a smile, stepping back. "Of course," I murmured, though inside I burned. They shifted closer together, the photographers snapping frames of their polished smiles. I stood to the side, clapping faintly when the flashes ended, as if to pretend it didn't matter. But I knew what they had done. They weren't just cutting me from a photograph. They were erasing me from memory. As I watched Maud in the center of the portrait, glowing, I thought about how families weaponize shame. They take moments like these and wield them as proof, rewriting history with every exclusion. I remembered words I once read from Maya Angelou. "You may not control all the events that happen to you, but you can decide not to be reduced by them." I whispered the line to myself like a shield. They wanted to reduce me, but I would not let them. Humiliation had crystallized into something else. I couldn't afford to only envy Maud or sulk in shame. What I needed was action, a plan. Revenge not through rage, but through transformation. As we left the restaurant, the neon lights of Houston reflected off wet pavement. Cars rushed by, horns blaring, the city alive, indifferent to my invisibility. I walked behind the rest of my family, their laughter floating ahead of me like a language I no longer spoke. They toasted her as the real child, I thought, staring at my shadow under the street lamp. They cut me from the portrait, but they haven't seen the fire that picture left out. When we returned to the house after that suffocating dinner and the photo session that excluded me, the mansion no longer felt like home. The lights in the foyer glowed, but the air was colder than any night outside. My heels echoed across the marble floor, each step heavy, as if I were walking into a tribunal. I knew before I reached the study that my parents were waiting. The doors were ajar, a slice of lamplight spilling into the hallway, and I could hear the measured cadence of my father's breathing. Inside, the room felt more like a courtroom than a sanctuary. Leather chairs, the grand desk polished to a mirror sheen, family portraits staring down with judgment. My father sat behind the desk, shoulders squared, his eyes cutting through me like knives. My mother perched beside him, her arms crossed neatly, every strand of her hair in place. "Sit," my father said. Not a request, but an order. I lowered myself into the chair opposite them. My chest tightened. This wasn't family. It was business. Worse, it was termination. "You embarrassed us last night," he began, his voice clipped and sharp. "First at the deal and then again at dinner. Do you understand the position you've put this family in?" I swallowed, but before I could respond, my mother cut in. "Perception is everything, Sybil. People saw weakness. We cannot allow that." I wanted to shout that it wasn't weakness, it was betrayal, that they had abandoned me in front of everyone, but their eyes told me they weren't here to listen. In this house, I thought bitterly, I wasn't a daughter anymore. I was a liability waiting to be erased. My father pulled open the desk drawer and placed my corporate credit card on the table between us. He stared at it as if it were evidence in a trial. "This is the last time you embarrass this family on our dime." He lifted a pair of scissors and, without hesitation, snapped the card in half. The sound was small, yet it thundered through me like a gavel strike. He set the broken pieces in front of me as though delivering a sentence. I leaned forward, my voice shaking but steady. "I only failed once. You can't define me by one deal." His reply was instant. "You failed us, Sybil. That's all that matters." My fists clenched beneath the table. You raised me to believe I'd have a place here. You told me I belonged. You belonged until you proved otherwise, he shot back. Mother's voice softened, but her words were no less cruel. Consider this tough love. One day, you'll thank us. From the corner of my eye, I caught movement in the hallway, staff pretending to dust, but their ears tilted toward the door. The humiliation spread quickly. I could almost feel whispers carrying through the house. Then came the final blow. My father rose, walked to the corner of the study, and wheeled forward a suitcase. My suitcase, already packed, clothes folded neatly inside. I stared at it, stunned. You planned this? He didn't answer. My mother did. You'll learn more out there than you ever did here. My throat tightened. It wasn't discipline. It was disownment without the paperwork. Minutes later, I found myself standing on the curb outside the mansion. The humid Houston night pressed against me as I clutched the suitcase handle. The gates behind me closed with a metallic click, as final as any locked cell. I bent down, unzipping the case to see what little they had given me. Some clothes, a few toiletries, but something important was missing. My leather notebook, the one where I had sketched ideas, strategies, the visions I hadn't dared to share aloud. Panic surged as I rifled through every pocket. Gone. I glanced up toward the house. There, in the upstairs window, stood Maud. She wasn't hiding. She held the notebook casually in one hand, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of her room. Our eyes met across the distance, and though I couldn't hear her, I remembered her earlier words as if she whispered them again. Every family has a black sheep. She closed the blinds slowly, deliberately, as though sealing her ownership of my thoughts, my voice, my future. The humiliation of being cast out was one thing. But this was theft. They hadn't just cut me off. They had armed my rival with the very ideas I had nurtured in silence. I pressed the suitcase shut with trembling hands, fury flooding through me. Losing money was one thing. Losing belonging hurt more. But losing my voice, stolen and twisted to strengthen the sister who thrived on my ruin, this was war. I sat on the curb, the night heavy around me, cicadas buzzing in the distance, headlights flashing by as strangers drove past, unaware of the exile playing out on that stretch of concrete. I lifted my head, the sting of tears hardening into resolve. They believed cutting me off was the end of me, I thought, but every exile learns to sharpen her own weapons. I walked into the corporate building the following morning as though nothing had happened, though my stomach churned with dread. The glass doors reflected me back in sharp detail, wrinkled blouse, sleepless eyes, but a spine that refused to bend. The receptionist hesitated when she saw me, her smile faltering, but she didn't stop me. I knew the layout by heart. My steps carried me toward the boardroom, where muffled voices and laughter floated under the door. I pushed it open and froze. There was Maud, standing tall before the executives, gesturing with polished confidence. Slides lit up behind her. My breath caught in my throat. She was presenting my concept, every chart, every projection, every line of reasoning I had written in that notebook she had stolen. "This is my strategy for moving us forward," she announced. One of the executives clapped his hands together. "Brilliant, Maud. Exactly what we need." My vision blurred with fury. I gripped the back of a chair to keep from collapsing, my nails biting into the leather. They didn't just steal paper. They stole my voice, my ideas, the very proof of my worth. I stood at the back of the room, silent, watching applause ripple around her. Maud glanced over, and for a moment our eyes locked. Her smirk was subtle, but I saw it, victory shining in her face. She knew exactly what she had done. When the meeting ended, I waited in the hallway, pulse pounding. As she emerged, I stepped in front of her. "That was my idea," I said, my voice low but trembling with rage. She didn't flinch. Instead, she tilted her head, amused. "Ideas are only real when someone strong enough owns them, Sybil. You think theft makes you strong?" "No," she replied, brushing past me, her perfume sharp. "Execution does. And you've never been able to execute." She walked away, heels clicking, her laughter echoing down the corridor. I stood rooted to the floor, fists shaking. Brute force wouldn't win. Yelling wouldn't win, not in a family like this. In this house, truth didn't survive unless it was backed by power. That night, in the silence of my small rented apartment, the walls seemed to press in on me. The fridge hummed, neighbors argued faintly through the thin drywall. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty space where my notebook should have been. I felt stripped bare. No luxury, no family safety net, just me and the echo of humiliation. The spiral came quickly, questions of worth, of whether I had been doomed from the start. I pressed my palms against my temples, whispering to the quiet room, maybe they were right, maybe I'm nothing without them. But another thought cut through. I remembered the words of Eleanor Roosevelt I had once underlined in a book. Great minds discuss ideas, average minds discuss events, small minds discuss people. I exhaled slowly. If they stole one idea, I could create 10 more. They couldn't steal the part of me that kept creating, the fire that refused to be extinguished. The next morning, I trudged back from the corner mailbox with a handful of bills and advertisements. Among them was a letter, the handwriting faintly familiar. My chest tightened as I tore it open. It was from Aunt Esme, the relative everyone pretended never existed, the woman cast out years before I was even born. Her words were steady, careful. They once erased me too, but erasure can be freedom if you choose it. Don't let them define your limits. Survival is not only possible outside their shadow, it's brighter. Tears filled my eyes, not from weakness, but recognition. She had walked this path before me, and she had survived. Maybe she was the only one who could understand. I pressed the letter against my chest, whispering into the empty room. This is my anchor. Proof I can survive this. That evening, I taped Esme's letter above the small desk in my apartment. The paper trembled slightly under the weight of tape, but the words held steady. Around it, I scattered scraps of paper, loose notes, sketches, half-formed plans. They may own the boardroom, I thought, as I pressed another scrap into place. But they will never own my future. I sat down, pen in hand, and began sketching again, my tears drying into quiet determination. The co-working space in Austin was modest, but it was mine. The walls were whitewashed, the carpet a little worn, and the hum of laptops mixed with the faint hiss of the coffee machine in the shared kitchen. Still, to me, it felt like a beginning. On my corner desk stood a whiteboard covered in sketches of business models, arrows linking problems to solutions, and half-erased notes from long nights of brainstorming. My laptop buzzed softly, open to a spreadsheet of potential clients. Across from me sat Claire, a fellow entrepreneur who rented space by the hour. She looked at my board with an approving nod. You know, she said, sipping from her chipped mug, this is how empires start. Small, scrappy, in rooms like this. I smiled, though my chest tightened with the weight of memory. I need to believe that, I admitted. For the first time in weeks, I feel like what I'm building belongs to me. No family name. No one else's shadow. Claire leaned in. Then don't stop. Keep writing on that board until you run out of markers. That's when you know you're onto something. Her encouragement settled like a steady flame inside me. I straightened the papers on my desk, thinking, finally, I am stirring ownership over my future. But hope is fragile, and mine was about to be shattered. The door swung open with a burst of laughter that didn't belong in a place of work. Maud walked in, her heels sharp against the floor, followed by two cousins who trailed her like a court of jesters. Well, well, Maud said, surveying the room. So this is the Empire headquarters? Cozy. I stiffened, refusing to stand. What are you doing here? Dropping by, she said airily. Wanted to see what you've been wasting your time on. The cousins chuckled as they took in the tiny desks and secondhand chairs. One pulled out his phone, pointing the camera my way. People are going to love this, he muttered, already tapping into a live stream. Before I could protest, Maud stepped into the frame, flipping her hair. Everyone, meet our little bankruptcy queen, she announced to the online world. Running her hobby shop from a corner of Austin. Isn't it adorable? My stomach dropped. Within seconds, hearts, laughing emojis, and mocking comments filled the screen. Does this even count as a business? one cousin added, zooming in on my whiteboard. Look at this, doodles on a wall. Claire stood up, trying to intervene. This is a workplace. You can't just… Maud silenced her with a glance. Relax, we're just having fun. The laughter from the phone's speaker was cruel, strangers piling onto a joke at my expense. My heart raced, humiliation washing over me, but I forced myself to sit still. They wanted me to explode, I thought, but I refused to give them the satisfaction. I rose slowly, walked to the cousin holding the phone, and without a word, I plucked it from his hand. The comments froze on the screen as I ended the stream. I placed the phone back into his stunned palm and looked at Maud. When you finish mocking me, I said evenly, I'll still be here building. What will you have built besides a reputation for cruelty? For the first time, her smirk faltered. The cousins shifted uncomfortably, one muttering, Let's just go. Maud recovered quickly, laughing it off. Calm down, Sybil. Don't take everything so seriously. Yet I caught the flicker of unease in her eyes. She hadn't expected composure. The staff around the co-working space watched in silence. A few nodded at me, quiet respect replacing pity. I sat back at my desk, my hands trembling under the table. Silence had cut deeper than rage. Days later, betrayal arrived again, this time from someone I thought I could trust. Lena, a friend who had promised to invest a small sum in my project, called me to meet at a cafe. I rushed there, clinging to hope, only to find her with an apologetic smile. I'm pulling out, she said, avoiding my gaze. I blinked. What? You told me you believed in this. You said you wanted to help me get it off the ground. She stirred her coffee, still not looking at me. It's just business, Sybil. You understand. My chest hollowed. Business? Or did Maud get to you? Her silence was the only answer I needed. I leaned back, the chair creaking beneath me. So you'll work with her instead. She offered me a consulting role, Lena admitted finally. It was too good to turn down. The words felt like knives. Betrayal layered itself on top of humiliation until I could hardly breathe. In America, I thought bitterly, betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it wears the face of your closest ally. That evening, back at the co-working space, the board loomed before me half erased, plans smudged by hours of doubt. I stood staring at it until the lights dimmed automatically. If my family and my friends want to see me fall, I whispered, then I'll make my rise a spectacle they can't ignore. The vow settled in my chest like iron. They thought mockery and betrayal would end me. Instead, they had pushed me into open war. The cafe on Congress Avenue buzzed with the usual mid-morning chatter. Business meetings, students hunched over laptops, mothers corralling toddlers with muffins. I sat at a corner table, my hands wrapped tightly around a coffee mug that had long gone cold. In front of me was a neat folder with charts and projections, every line rehearsed until I could recite it in my sleep. For the first time in months, I felt a sliver of possibility. Across from me sat Daniel Harper, a mid-level investor with a reputation for spotting promising ventures. He leafed through my folder with furrowed brows, then looked up. Your idea has potential, he said, measured but not dismissive. I've always believed the people worth backing are the ones who rise after setbacks. You look like you've taken your share of hits. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I've been waiting for someone to say that, I replied softly. I don't want pity, Daniel. I want someone who sees the bones of what I'm building. He smiled faintly. Well, bones are a start. But can they stand? I leaned forward. They will. I've lived enough failure to know what not to repeat. For the first time in a long while, cautious optimism pushed back the weight of humiliation. This could be the first true step towards something that belonged to me, not my family. The conversation was flowing until he set the folder down with a sigh. His next words sliced through my hope like a blade. Your sister called me yesterday, he said, almost apologetically. I froze. Maud? He nodded. She warned me. Said your last venture nearly bankrupted the family. She told me to be careful, that you're reckless with numbers. I could barely breathe. She did what? He lowered his voice. Look, I don't know the family politics, but investors spook easily. Reputations matter. If there's any truth to what she said— There isn't, I snapped, heat rushing to my cheeks. She's protecting her own position by destroying mine. Daniel sighed again, pushing the folder back toward me. I'm sorry. The idea is good, but I can't tie myself to drama. I have to step away. My throat burned as he stood, leaving a few bills for his untouched coffee before slipping out the door. Just like that, another door slammed shut, not because I had failed, but because Maud had stolen the chance before it ever belonged to me. I sat there, staring at the folder as if it had betrayed me too. In business, I thought bitterly, reputation can be stolen faster than money. Days later, the damage spread like fire. I woke one morning to a knock on my apartment door. Claire, the woman from the co-working space, stood with a newspaper in hand, her face tight with pity. You should see this, she said, handing it over. The headline screamed across the page. Heiress fails again. Family left, cleaning up the mess. My stomach lurched. The article painted me as reckless, a spoiled daughter who played at business while her family footed the bill. Anonymous family insiders had leaked stories of my failures, exaggerated into grotesque parodies of truth. I skimmed through, my pulse pounding. Words like useless, liability, embarrassment jumped off the page, branding me with labels I hadn't chosen. Claire shook her head. This is brutal. They're not just shutting doors, they're rewriting your story. I gripped the paper until it crumpled in my hands. They want the world to laugh at me before I can even stand. And it was working. Social media picked up the story within hours, my name trending for all the wrong reasons. Strangers mocked me with memes, turning my failures into punchlines. It was a smear campaign orchestrated with surgical precision, each blow designed to bury me deeper. But humiliation has a strange alchemy. It can break you, or it can harden into steel. Late one night, I sat at my desk under the dim glow of a second-hand lamp. The tabloid lay torn in the trash. In front of me, a fresh sheet of paper stared back. I picked up my pen. If they want to paint me as useless, I whispered, I'll make their brushstrokes backfire. I thought of Abraham Lincoln's words I had once read. Character is like a tree, and reputation like its shadow. The shadow is what we think of it. The tree is the real thing. They were playing with shadows, twisting them into grotesque shapes. But I knew what I was. The tree stood, whether or not they saw it. I began sketching again. New plans, sharper strategies. Each line on the page felt like a strike against the lies. If they built their empire on smearing me, then my defiance would come not with yelling, but with building something undeniable. The humiliation evolved into determination. I was done playing defense. By dawn, scraps of paper covered the wall above my desk, notes pinned over the headlines that had mocked me. I stood back, heart steady. They had turned the city against me, but they forgot one truth. Silence could be strategy, and I knew how to wield it. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, the marble floors polished to perfection, and the air thick with the perfume of wealth and power. As I stepped inside, I could feel every eye turning toward me, not in welcome, but in judgment. My dress was simple, practical, chosen more for dignity than glamour, and it stood out awkwardly among the sequins and tailored suits that filled the room. Relatives whispered as I passed. Some tilted their heads with pity, others smirked with quiet satisfaction. They had seen the articles, heard the gossip, and tonight felt like a stage set for my final humiliation. I straightened my back, forcing each step to be deliberate. Inside, the tables gleamed with crystal glasses and fine china, laughter spilling from one cluster of guests to another. My family was at the center table, of course. My father with his commanding presence, my mother graceful but severe, and Maud glowing like a chosen heir. As I found my seat on the margin, far from the spotlight, I whispered to myself, I thought they'd humiliated me enough behind closed doors. Tonight, they proved me wrong. Halfway through the evening, my father rose. The room fell into silence, anticipation hanging heavy. He held a glass of wine aloft, his voice booming with pride. Tonight, he began, we honor the future of this family. Strength, vision, and perseverance are what carry us forward. He placed his hand on Maud's shoulder. Here she is, the pride of the Ainsworth name. Polite applause broke out, guests clinking glasses, nodding in approval. I held my breath, knowing what was coming but praying to be wrong. Then he gestured lazily in my direction. And of course, our other daughter. The useless one. The room froze. For a moment, you could have heard a pin drop. Then came the nervous laughter, the sideways glances, the whispers. Did he just say that? One guest murmured to another. That's brutal, another replied, shaking his head. I sat frozen, a smile plastered on my face while my hands trembled in my lap. My stomach hollowed, and every muscle screamed to run. The words branded me, cementing my identity as a failure in front of the city's elite. This was no longer private humiliation. It was public truth. I forced myself not to cry. I wouldn't give them that. Inside, though, a storm raged, shock, fury, betrayal sharper than any knife. After the toast, when chatter resumed, a journalist raised his hand from the press table. "Mr. Ainsworth," he called out, "a question about your daughters. How do you see both of them contributing to the family's legacy?" My father's face hardened, his voice cut like steel. "We have 2 children, one who carries the family forward. The other, well, she's chosen her path." The implication was clear. He had just disowned me, not with paperwork, but with words, spoken to the press, to investors, to everyone who mattered. My mother nodded slightly, complicit in her silence. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some lowering their eyes, none daring to intervene. They didn't just humiliate me, I thought. They erased me with words sharper than any blade. I rose quietly, excusing myself from the table. My head was high, though my chest burned with fire. Each step away from the ballroom felt heavier, but with every stride, defiance grew inside me. Humiliation burns, but it also forges. Outside the grand doors, I paused, staring at the reflection of the Houston skyline in the glass. The city lights shimmered like a challenge. I remembered a line from Winston Churchill I had once underlined in a book. "You will never reach your destination if you stop and throw stones at every dog that barks." They wanted me to bark, to lash out in that ballroom. But engaging them on their terms would mean losing before I began. True revenge had to come later, quiet, devastating, undeniable. As a journalist rushed after me, microphone in hand, calling my name for a comment, I ignored him. I stepped into the humid Houston night, the air thick against my skin, carrying with it the heat of my silent fury. "They erased me from their family tonight," I whispered into the darkness. "They forgot exiles build their own kingdoms." The days after the gala dragged like years. My apartment felt smaller than ever, boxes half-packed in the corner as though my life itself had been evicted. The phone lay on the kitchen counter, buzzing occasionally with notifications I couldn't bear to read. Every headline was another dagger, mockery of my name, commentary about my father's declaration, strangers laughing at the useless daughter. The silence of the apartment roared louder than the world outside. I stood by the window, staring out at Houston's skyline, neon lights flickering across glass towers. That night in the ballroom had killed me in their world. I wasn't just humiliated, I was erased. If they had no use for me, then perhaps I needed to vanish completely, not in surrender, but in preparation. I whispered into the emptiness. They killed me in their story. Now I have to write my own. And with that, the decision took root. I would disappear from Houston. The following week, I moved quietly. No announcements, no goodbyes. I bought a bus ticket to Austin with the last of my savings, clutching a single suitcase that held the remnants of my independence. The ride south was bumpy, filled with strangers dozing against windows, their faces slack with exhaustion. I sat among them, invisible, and for once, invisibility felt like armor. In Austin, I rented a small room above a laundromat, its air heavy with detergent and steam. For 2 weeks, I scribbled plans late at night, tried odd jobs during the day, filing papers, wiping counters, anything that paid. Exile wasn't glamorous, it was survival. But even there, whispers followed. My landlord eyed me when I gave notice earlier than expected. "You're moving again already. Didn't even settle in." I forced a polite smile. "I have to keep going." Inside, I thought, every exile has a season of invisibility. This was mine. Better to be unseen than mocked. Eventually, I saved just enough for a budget flight to New York. The city swallowed me whole, crowded subways, honking cabs, streets buzzing at every hour. No one knew me there. No one cared. That anonymity was a gift. One evening, after scanning flyers on a bulletin board, I walked into a small networking event for startups. The room smelled of coffee and ambition, filled with eager faces pitching apps and services. I stood near the back, listening more than speaking, until a woman approached me. She was composed, her voice calm but firm. "You don't talk like someone who's failed," she said after we spoke briefly. "You talk like someone who's been underestimated." Her name was Ingrid Bly. I recognized it later from articles, an investor with quiet influence, known not for splashy deals, but for backing resilience. I met her gaze. "Underestimation is the story of my life," she smiled slightly. "Good, because underestimated people usually know how to surprise." I almost laughed. If only surprise paid the bills. "Not yet," she said, handing me her card. "But knowledge can. I won't give you money now, but I'll give you direction. If you're serious, meet me again. I'll show you what matters." For the first time since Houston, hope stirred, cautious, fragile, but real. Weeks passed, and Ingrid became my quiet mentor. She led me to the public library, showed me stacks of books on finance and market strategy, challenged me with questions that forced me to think beyond survival. Nights were spent bent over notebooks, scribbling calculations by the glow of old lamps. The contrast struck me. The marble halls of Houston, where I had been erased, versus the crowded streets of New York, where anonymity gave me freedom to learn without ridicule. I thought often of Thomas Edison's words, "Genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration." I repeated it whenever exhaustion pressed heavy on me. Inspiration had been stolen by my family, but perspiration was mine to command. One night, I closed a worn book and stared at my reflection in the library's glass window. My face looked older, sharper. They had erased me, but in the silence, I was rewriting myself. At sunrise on a cold morning, I walked onto the Brooklyn Bridge. The city stretched out before me, endless and alive. The wind cut at my face, but I lifted my chin. Invisible now, but not forever. "They thought silence meant defeat," I whispered. "They didn't know silence was my training ground." Returning to Houston after months away felt like stepping into a city that had been rebuilt without me. The streets were familiar, yet the billboards above them stung in a way I hadn't prepared for. Maud's face was everywhere, smiling in advertisements, captioned as "the future of Ainsworth Holdings." Her name was printed where mine had once been whispered, back when there had been even a faint chance I would inherit more than shame. I walked slowly through downtown, past the luxury boutiques and glimmering glass towers, feeling the weight of invisibility cloak me. Tonight, the family was hosting the Successors Gala in a grand hotel ballroom, complete with gold banners and press cameras already crowding the entrance. I blended into the guests, my simple dress ensuring no one gave me a second glance. That anonymity was a gift. Inside, chandeliers blazed, their light bouncing off champagne flutes and sequined gowns. I kept to the shadows, finding a seat at the far edge. "They thought I had vanished for good," I whispered to myself. "Tonight, I came back, not to join, but to watch." The ceremony began with triumphant music. Maud stepped onto the stage, radiant, her gown gleaming under the spotlights. My father followed, his voice filling the room with practiced authority. "Tonight," he declared, "we honor the child who will carry our legacy forward. Strength, vision, and discipline, qualities our company demands, are embodied in Maud Ainsworth." Applause thundered. My mother beamed, her eyes sweeping over the crowd but skipping right past me. Cameras flashed, capturing Maud's smile, the crown of success placed firmly on her head. My chest burned, anger mixing with grim satisfaction. They built her throne from my ashes, but ashes still burn. As the evening wore on, I drifted closer to groups of investors whispering in hushed tones. I caught fragments of doubt. Profits have dipped. Her appointment feels rushed. Too much show, not enough substance. The cracks were faint but present. Then a journalist raised his hand during the QA, his voice cutting through the clinking glasses. "What about your other daughter?" The room shifted, eyes flicking toward me, though no one pointed. My father's reply was cold, dismissive. "Irrelevant. Tonight is about Maud." The sting was sharp, but this time anger steadied me instead of collapsing me. I don't need their stage to tell my story. I have my own weapon. And then it happened. Midway through Maud's speech about integrity and vision, a murmur rippled across the press tables. Reporters leaned over their phones, expressions hardening. Seconds later, the ballroom screen flickered, hijacked by a recording. Maud's voice filled the room, sharp and mocking. "She's pathetic! Little bankruptcy! I made sure that deal fell apart so she'd never stand again." Gasps erupted. Guests clutched their pearls, whispers multiplying like wildfire. "She ruined her own sister to rise." "If she lies about that, what else has she lied about?" Maud's face drained of color as she sputtered. "That's out of context. It's fake." But the damage was done. Reporters surged forward, flashing cameras, shouting questions. "Did you sabotage your sister's deal? How can this company be trusted under your leadership?" My parents scrambled, my father gripping the podium, my mother's hand trembling as she tried to hush the chaos. But nothing stopped it. The room was no longer under their control. I sat in the back, heart steady, watching as vindication replaced humiliation. For the first time, their cruelty echoed louder against them than me. The ballroom descended into confusion, investors storming out, journalists circling like hawks, Maud nearly in tears as her crown slipped in real time. I slipped quietly out the side door, unnoticed. On the street, the night air was cool, the city alive with noise. I exhaled, the weight of years lifting from my shoulders. They crowned her tonight, I thought, but the crown was already cracked. The scandal from the gala didn't fade. It erupted. Within hours, the headlines were plastered across every business outlet and local paper. Ainsworth legacy in question. Successor sabotage? The recording of Maud's mocking voice played on repeat. "Little bankruptcy. I made sure that deal fell apart." I sat in my New York apartment, the glow of the television bouncing off half-drawn blinds, unable to look away. For years, I had been the punchline. Now, they were. Outside Ainsworth headquarters in Houston, reporters camped like hunters waiting for the wounded to stagger out. On the morning broadcasts, one anchor leaned forward and asked pointedly, "If Maud sabotaged her own sister, how can she lead a company with integrity?" Another answered, "She can't. The public doesn't forget this kind of betrayal." I watched, a mix of satisfaction and disbelief flooding me. The truth, long buried under their money and influence, was finally in the open. Inside the company walls, the consequences deepened. Investors began withdrawing, and the stock price plunged. Leaked snippets of tense conference calls revealed the panic. One investor barked into the phone, "We can't tie our money to scandal. We're pulling out." Another voice followed, clipped and cold. "If leadership isn't stable, the empire will fall." It was strange to hear the same words my father had once spat at me, about failure, about being a liability, now aimed at his chosen heir. I thought of the night he cut my credit card in half, telling me I had failed them all. And yet, here he was, watching his empire crumble under the daughter he had crowned as untouchable. They cut me out to protect the family, I thought. In the end, cutting me out destroyed them. Whispers from the mansion reached me too. A private dinner had devolved into chaos, my parents arguing with Maud as the servants lingered in nearby hallways. "You've ruined everything," my mother hissed, voice sharp enough to slice. "It was one mistake," Maud shouted back, her tone laced with desperation. "One mistake?" my father roared. "That recording is everywhere. One mistake has destroyed decades of credibility. They were unraveling, and though I wasn't there, I didn't need to be. Every word spilled through leaks, every detail printed by hungry journalists. I sat far away, in quiet liberation, watching their collapse from a distance. Still, I resisted the urge to gloat publicly. Revenge wasn't about rubbing salt in wounds. It was about building something they could never touch. Martin Luther King Jr.'s words echoed in my head. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Justice wasn't fast, but it was finally bending my way, so I kept working. Ingrid guided me through strategies, connecting me to small partners who valued persistence over pedigree. In the evenings, I sat at my desk sketching plans while the television played background noise of my family's empire bleeding on live news. Their stock charts plummeted in red streaks across the screen, while I pinned new notes above my desk in blue ink. Ideas, projections, alliances forming quietly. They burned their kingdom trying to erase me, I wrote in my journal. I am building mine from the ground. The contrast was stark. On one screen, chaos, camera flashes exploding outside the Houston mansion as my parents ducked behind drawn curtains, faces pale with panic. On my desk, calm order, papers stacked neatly, outlines of projects that carried the seed of a future beyond their reach. I leaned back, exhaling. They mocked me once for failing a deal. Now they were failing an empire, and in that truth, I found strength. The first time I had walked out of the Ainsworth headquarters, I had nothing, just a suitcase, my dignity in shreds, and a notebook stolen from me. Now, 3 years later, I returned through those same glass doors, no longer the erased daughter, but the owner of their fate. The lobby seemed smaller than I remembered, stripped of its intimidation. Staff glanced up from their desks, whispering, their eyes flickering with recognition and disbelief. Even the security guards who once ignored me now nodded respectfully as I passed. I paused at the threshold of the boardroom, taking in the sight, the long, polished table, the anxious faces of executives, the stack of papers waiting for signatures. 3 years ago, they pushed me out these doors with nothing. Today, I walk back in owning everything. The meeting began with tension so sharp it cut the air. My parents sat at the head of the table, Maud beside them, her hands folded neatly, though her knuckles were white. Across from them, the company's lawyer stood ready. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we are here to finalize the sale of controlling interest in Ainsworth Holdings. An anonymous buyer has acquired majority shares and will now assume control." Nervous glances darted across the room. My father's jaw clenched. My mother's smile trembled. "Perhaps," my father said, forcing composure, "this new investor will restore what was lost." The lawyer gestured toward the door. "Allow me to introduce the buyer." I stepped into the room. Silence followed, broken only by the sound of someone's pen clattering to the floor. My father shot to his feet. "This is a joke." "No," I said, my voice steady. "This is business, and business remembers." Shock rippled through the room, Maud's face drained of color. My mother whispered, "Impossible," as if saying it aloud might undo the truth. I sat at the table, sliding into the seat opposite them. "For years, you told me I was useless. Tonight, I am the majority shareholder of everything you thought I couldn't handle." The lawyer opened a thick folder, spreading documents across the table. "These are the final papers. This requires your signature, Mr. and Mrs. Ainsworth." I leaned forward, eyes fixed on my father. "Funny, isn't it? You once erased my name from your board. Now you'll write it over everything." His hand shook as he reached for the pen. My mother's eyes brimmed with fury, but she signed first, her lips pressed into a thin line. My father hesitated longer, glaring at me with the same intensity he once used to cut me down. But even he couldn't fight the ink. The pen scratched across the page, sounding like nails on a coffin lid. When the last signature was finished, I exhaled quietly. This wasn't just paperwork, it was history correcting itself. Maud slammed her hand on the table. "You tricked us. You couldn't build this yourself." I turned to her calmly. "You built your throne on betrayal. Thrones like that always collapse. The room was chaos, investors whispering, journalists outside pressing against glass doors. But at the center, I remained composed, no gloating, no shouts, just steady dignity. Oprah Winfrey's words rang true in my mind. The greatest revenge is massive success. I hadn't destroyed them for the sake of destruction. I had built myself beyond their reach, and in doing so, I had taken everything they thought was safe. As the investors shook my hand one by one, as cameras flashed when the doors opened, I thought of the years of humiliation, of being told I was nothing, of being erased, and how I had turned silence into a strategy that ended here. I walked out into the Houston sunlight, the weight of the building behind me, cameras flashing, reporters shouting, my voice carried above the chaos. They once called me useless. Today, I walked away with their empire. The taste of revenge was sharp, but freedom was sweeter. This victory wasn't about holding them down. It was about proving I never needed their name to stand. I thought of the others like me, underestimated, discarded, erased, and I knew what came next. I would invest in them, mentor them, make sure no one else's worth could be stolen by arrogance or cruelty. They taught me that family could erase you, I whispered to myself as I moved through the crowd. I taught them that erasure can be the start of an empire.